I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer.
And I'm Lewis from Then and Now.
We're taking a look at Anarchy Works, Examples of Anarchist Ideas in Practice, by Peter Gelderloos, Ardent Press, 2010. The key idea of this text is that anarchism as a political philosophy, well, works. That anarchism is not a chaotic nightmare as it's often portrayed in popular media. Hello, welcome to Anarchist Society. Here's your complimentary baseball bat and Molotov cocktail. You're going to want to get your hands on some AK ammo as soon as... But also, anarchism is not an impossible utopian dream as critics of anarchist philosophy would have us believe. Like, hello, welcome to our anarchist society. Everyone gets everything they want without having to do things they don't want. Like, nobody works and everything's organic and we all just vibe, you know? No, this text argues that anarchy works, and it provides many examples of that fact. I mean, it's almost like an encyclopedic account of anarchism in action, addressing decision-making, economics, crime, the environment, basically any factor of society that one could think of as a challenge to anarchist philosophy. What do you think, Lewis?
I think the persuasive radical does two things well. Paints pictures of alternative societies that are convincing, coherent, and possible, while placing those pictures next to cogent critiques of the current system. It's common, for example, for skeptics to reject the feasibility of utopian ideas because they're contrasted with an idealized depiction of the state and the status quo. But people are greedy and self-interested, they'll say. We need detectives to solve murders and protect us. Free trade and markets and capitalism are just natural, they're human nature. Peter Gelderloos' Anarchy Works travels along this double axis, chipping away at the veneer of the benevolent protective state, while answering those common questions about how an alternative system might, and might being the key word here, work. In the tradition of empirical and anthropological accounts of anarchism by writers like Harold Barclay, Anarchy Works is an accessible tour of actually existing anarchist cultures, societies and groups throughout history and around the world. Gelderloos takes the kind of Q&A approach, providing the reader with the ammunition required for those "but how would X work?" questions, while supplying short, unintimidating lists of recommended readings thematically at the end of each chapter.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well anyway, with all that said, let's take a look at the text in depth. Introduction. To start us off, Gelderloos defines anarchism stating, "Anarchism is the boldest of revolutionary social movements to emerge from the struggle against capitalism." Wait, the struggle against capitalism? But what about anarcho-capitalism? No, I'm just kidding. Where was I? Anarchism aims for a world free from all forms of domination and exploitation, but at its heart is a simple and convincing position. People know how to live their own lives and organize themselves better than any expert could. So, anarchism is all about being free from domination and exploitation. Now, I personally don't like the use of the word expert at the end, just because of all the anti-intellectualism coming from the right, climate change denialism, vaccine denialism, alternative facts, and all that. I feel like the word expert could easily be taken out of context. It should perhaps instead read, "People know how to live their own lives and organize themselves better than any unjustified authority figure could." Anyway, Gelderloos then names some of the basic principles of anarchism. They are as follows. Autonomy and horizontality, meaning people should be self-directed in their lives and free from coercive, unjustified hierarchies. Mutual aid, meaning we should embrace our social inclinations towards generosity and solidarity with others. Voluntary association, meaning the breakdown of barriers allowing every individual to move freely, both physically and socially. Direct action, meaning anarchist goals are achieved directly by those involved rather than through authority figures or representatives. Revolution, meaning fighting to overthrow the corrupt system of capitalism and state power. And self-liberation, meaning that the people themselves must be at the forefront of their own liberation. Gelderloos then explains that of the 90 or so examples covered in the text, only about a third explicitly called what they were doing anarchist. Over half the examples are from present-day Western societies, while a third are from outside the Western world, with the remaining examples being classical historical accounts. Now you may be asking, okay, if anarchism is so great, and if it has been so successful throughout history and all over the world, why do we not live in an anarchist society right now? Well, Gelderloos explains that a lot of these examples were short-lived, primarily due to isolation, that many only impacted a small number of people, alliances, that some were co-opted or eventually decided to work with their local governments, and repression, that some were crushed by state power. Anyway, some definitions and general overview type groundwork out of the way, let's dive into the text proper. Chapter 1. Human Nature. Providing an anarchist view of human nature, Gelderloos states, anarchism challenges the typical Western conception of human nature by envisioning societies built on cooperation, mutual aid, and solidarity between people, rather than competition and survival of the fittest. But wait a minute. I've seen the Mad Max movies, I've seen Waterworld and Book of Eli and The Road, and I've played Fallout and Last of Us and This War of Mine. We all know that when the chips are down, when the DOG-SHIT hits the fan, everyone turns into marauding bands of vicious, bloodthirsty bandits, right? But I've also played Ark and Don't Starve and Minecraft, and I totally die all the time and let my friends down because I'm not very good at video games. But I've heard from other folks that those games demonstrate the advantage of mutual aid, that they show that we can accomplish so much more and be so much more successful when we embrace our natural inclination to work together. Gelderloos argues that sociological studies have found that in nearly all natural disasters, cooperation and solidarity among people increase, and it is common people, not governments, who voluntarily do most of the work carrying out rescues and protecting one another throughout the crisis. And, I mean, yeah, look at books like Tribe, which talk about how people who survived war zones and natural disasters, although happy to be out of danger, that they did miss the sense of camaraderie and the sense of purpose that comes from knowing that you are an essential part of a team doing vital work to help each other out. Also, look at books like Mutual Aid, which explain how, well, as Gelderloos puts it, if early human life had been as bloody and warlike as our mythology has depicted it, humans would simply have died out. Gelderloos concludes the chapter arguing that, without institutionalized competition and exploitation, a person's self-interest overlaps with the interests of her community and her environment. What do you think, Lewis?
One theme that's returned to throughout is gift economies, mutual aid, and egalitarianism. Most of liberal and capitalist economics is based on the chimera of the rational, self-interested actor looking to maximize gains for themselves. This modern belief ignores the abundance of evidence that many societies and cultures have acted in ways that directly contradict this. People living in gift economies, like hunter-gatherers often, tend to give away what they don't need without calculating value or recording debts. Rather than barter, for example, the semi of Malaysia's economic exchanges are more like Christmas exchanges than like commercial exchanges. It's considered punan, or taboo, to calculate the value of gifts. We find similar practices throughout many hunter-gatherer and historic cultures. Columbus was amazed that the indigenous people of the Americas seem to have no conception of property. Gelderloos also describes Enrico Quarantelli's work on the increase in social bonds, altruism and cooperation after natural disasters. Cooperation, rather than self-interest, is a human trait that comes up again and again under these kinds of conditions.
Oh yeah, for sure. And this stuff will come up again when we talk about anarchist economics in Chapter 3. But for now, let's take a look at Chapter 2, Decisions. This chapter is about self-autonomy, freedom from coercive authority. Gelderloos starts by making an argument that I often use when responding to people who claim that authoritarian rule is natural or necessary. He states, "We all have some experience with horizontal decision-making. Most of the decisions we make in daily life, with friends and hopefully with colleagues and family as well, we make on the basis of cooperation rather than authority. Think about your friends or family members or yourself coordinating the completion of a task with a coworker, divvying up household chores, playing in a local sports team, or setting up a potluck, or forming bands or various volunteer or fundraiser activities. What about D&D or Warhammer campaigns or other clubs? You name it. So much of our daily lives is actually done cooperatively with mutual aid rather than dictated to us by an authority figure. Now you might be thinking, okay, sure, so this works on an individual level when my partner and I decide who should take out the trash or wash the dishes, but how does this scale up to society at large? Well, to this end, Gelderloos discusses the landless workers movement in Brazil, which is made up of 1.5 million workers who made decisions at the grassroots level among the individual settlements from the bottom up, small groups to federated structures to national coordinating bodies. Gelderloos describes this decision-making process thusly. Someone states a proposal that synthesizes everyone's input, and they vote on it. Approve, abstain, or block. If one person is opposed, the group looks for another solution. The decisions may not always be everyone's first choice, but everyone must feel comfortable with every decision the group adopts. We saw similar decision-making strategies adopted by the Occupy movement.
When you want to show support to something that you're hearing, you twinkle.
Then there's, I'm okay with it, but not really. And then I disagree.
This, which is the point of process, when someone is getting off topic.
Louder means we can't hear you. Clarifying question.
If someone has a point of information, they'll throw up a finger.
This is the block.
If you make a block, it means you're so disagreeable to it that you will actually leave the movement or the working group if that's agreed upon.
Gelderloos continues. Consensus precludes the need for enforcement and punishment by making sure that everyone is satisfied beforehand. When we take into account all the work hours a community loses maintaining a police force, which is a huge drain on resources, the hours spent in consensus meetings seems like a good usage of time after all. This whole process is actually very similar to the federated structures of anarchist organization hypothesized by thinkers like Alexander Berkman or Peter Kropotkin, as we have seen in previous reviews. Further discussing enforcement of decisions, Gelderloos discusses diffuse sanctions, which is a process he defines as follows. In an ongoing process, a society decides how it wants to organize and what behaviors it considers unacceptable. If somebody breaks these common standards, everyone is accustomed to react. They don't call the police, file a grievance, or wait for someone else to do something. They approach the person they think is in the wrong and tell them, or take another appropriate action. Wow, well that sounds kind of cool, right? But I see two problems with this. For one, although this process might be more adaptable to the variety of circumstances compared to like a rigid book of laws, but like we saw in ContraPoint's video on justice, without a third-party set of laws to appeal to, vengeance and blood feuds between those involved in the injustice often lead to spirals of violent reaction and revenge.
Such a lust for revenge!
Secondly, as anyone who's worked at, well, basically any workplace could tell you, it is nice to have a manager or some impartial third party to settle disputes between coworkers rather than try and have those involved hash it out themselves. Now, I don't think these critiques are full-on debunkings of the concept of diffuse sanctions, just that we must keep these things in mind when we attempt to implement such a practice. And Gelderloos does address some of this in the chapter on crime, where he explains how decentralized groups used third parties within themselves to mitigate disputes. Anyway, Gelderloos concludes the chapter arguing that if there are multiple decision-making structures for different spheres of life, and if they can arise or fade out according to need, none of them can monopolize authority. In this regard, power needs to stay in the streets, in the homes, in the hands of the people who exercise it, and in the meeting of people who come together to solve problems. Chapter 3, Economy. This chapter starts by critiquing the idea that market incentives are required to motivate people to work or to innovate, by pointing to all our other desires like self-determination and having an impact on our community and feeling a sense of purpose and things like that. Perhaps you've seen that old YouTube video called The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us, which is essentially about all these other drives.
I think the science shows that we care about mastery very, very deeply. and the science shows that we want to be self-directed.
I love poking holes in the argument that people need capitalist market incentives to force them to work and innovate. Some of my favorite examples are pointing to all the innovation and hard work that took place prior to capitalism, or to the inventions and developments in nations that are often labeled not capitalist, or to the various inventions created with public funding or by military scientists or otherwise outside of market incentives, or to all the free software and apps and mods and music and movies and everything else that people make for a fun hobby with no intent or expectation to profit from their hard work. Next, Gelderloos talks about worker-ran enterprises, such as the hundreds of thousands of worker-controlled factories in Italy after World War I, the hundreds of worker-controlled factories in Argentina after the economic crash of 2001, and he, of course, brings up Mondragon.
Mondragon. The Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. Mondragon.
But Gelderloos is critical of Mondragon, stating, "The compulsion to be profitable and competitive has pushed the cooperatives to manage their own exploitation. This being a problem that would face any worker-controlled enterprise fighting to exist within a broader capitalist economy." Now, you might be thinking, okay, so people will work without market incentives and can even organize their own workplaces. But what about those who can't? What about those who face handicaps, or are elderly, or are sick? Well, regarding this, Gelderloos discusses everything from the workers' assemblies in Argentina, funding hospitals and care facilities, to the medical syndicates in Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War, to the Black Panther Party's food and clinic programs, to the Bay Area Radical Health Collective, and other healthcare-focused mutual aid groups. Then, discussing innovation and future technology within an anarchist society, Gelderloos discusses the modern advancement and popularity of open source software, Wikipedia, Firefox, Linux, and other positive examples of what is essentially anarchist technological innovation. He then talks a little bit about traditional gift economies, which might seem irrelevant to our modern age, right? I mean, it's the 21st century for crying out loud. When was the last time you did a hunter-gatherer style exchange of goods? But Gelderloos jumps right into discussing free cycle networks, stuff like buy nothing groups on Facebook and things like that. I mean, I don't know about you, but I know folks who've gotten free firewood, a free water heater, free chicken coop, or other items totally free just because the previous owner no longer wanted them and put it up online that people could take them. Discussing upscaling these economic practices to the size of cities, Gelderloos states, "Anarchists have some experience maintaining large cities. The solution seems to lie in maintenance workers taking over the organization of the infrastructure for which they are responsible, and neighborhoods forming assemblies so that nearly all other decisions can be made at a local level, where anyone can participate." And he gives the example of El Alto, Bolivia, where 200 or so neighbors maintain schools and parks and utilities, all anarchisty and such. And Gelderloos concludes, "If people are ensured access to common resources and spared the poverty of wage slavery, they will create plenty of the things they need and that give them pleasure, as well as the infrastructure required to make and distribute these things." Anything you want to add on economics, Lewis?
Why would anyone work or contribute to a society where sharing was the norm? Well, Gelderloos forcefully cites evidence from around the globe that the absence of wage labour has not meant societies descend into laziness. The kibbutz in Israel, for example, traditionally had 4 psychological motivations for contributing. Group productivity affects the whole community. Competitive pride between branches, people earn prestige from their work, and control and choice of work increases personal satisfaction. He also cites open source, decentralized software and websites like Wikipedia as platforms that thrive because of unpaid contributions. He points to social works like the Tayata Hills irrigation system in Kenya, which lasted for centuries because it was maintained by social Harambee labour, which literally means pull together. The British colonists replaced a system that had worked for centuries with one that eventually failed during a drought in the 60s. During the Spanish Civil War, when anarchists controlled large parts of the country, one commentator wrote that Everyone works, and everyone has the right to what he needs free of charge. He simply goes to the store where provisions and all other necessities are supplied. Everything is distributed free, with only a notation of what he took. What's frequently observed in non-state societies is that altruism and simple social norms and bonds are often enough to encourage a cooperative economy. But this isn't always the case, and Gelderloos is careful not to depict an overly optimistic and idealized view of human nature, which is one of the things I like about the book. The Dunbar number, although not mentioned specifically, keeps coming to mind. Many of the groups are limited to sizes where everyone knows one another. This is addressed somewhat in a brief discussion of Gore Associates, a highly successful billion-dollar fabric firm that keeps the sizes of their factories to between 100 and 150 people, so that each factory can be self-managing.
Chapter 4, Environment. In the book Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher warned us that climate change is an issue that we will either solve democratically ourselves, or solutions will be imposed on us by state authority. And here, Gelderloos makes a similar distinction, first admitting that the state does present the possibility of forcibly changing people's behavior on a massive scale, and this power is attractive to some environmentalists. But he ultimately concludes that a decentralized communal society with a commonly held ecological ethos is the best equipped to prevent environmental destruction. Some positive examples of this ethos in action are the Global Eco-Village Network in Scotland, The Farm in Tennessee, Old Basayasa in Egypt, Ecotop in Germany, Earthaven in North Carolina, among other examples. Gelderloos does admit that anarchists haven't yet tackled environmentalism on a global scale since their communities have been small and temporary. However, he counters that capitalism is the first social arrangement in human history to endanger the survival of our species and life on Earth in general. Now, a common critique of decentralized land management is something called the tragedy of the commons, which is essentially a thought experiment in which we imagine several shepherds sharing a field, and each one of them will destroy the field by overgrazing their livestock at the expense of everyone else. This is meant to show that anarchist or communist collective land ownership will be an ecological disaster.
Every herdsman that puts an animal on the field will get the direct benefit that that animal provides for them, but they would only share a portion of the cost of the degraded field. If the field were at carrying capacity and a herdsman decides to add an extra animal, the added animal takes some of the food that would have gone to the others. This reduces their value. The owner of that additional animal comes out ahead because even though all his animals are a little bit less healthy, he has more of them.
Critiquing this myth of the tragedy of the commons, Gelderloos states, "The sheep herding scenario assumes a situation that is extremely rare in human history. A collective comprised of atomized competitive individuals who value personal wealth over social bonds and ecological health, and lack social arrangements or traditions that can guarantee sustainable shared use."
The problem with applying this model to the real world is that we have to assume, among other things, that people don't communicate or work together, which isn't true. With a field like this, people will generally get together and make plans about its use.
And Gelderloos concludes that localized egalitarian societies linked by global communication and awareness are the best chance for saving the environment. Chapter 5, Crime. Providing an anarchist understanding of the concept of crime, Gelderloos states, "Anarchists wish to create a society that can protect itself and resolve internal problems without police, judges, or prisons. A society that does not view its problems in terms of good and evil, permitted and prohibited, law-abiders and criminals." Comparing this to the mainstream view of criminality, Gelderloos explains that those in authority define criminal activity according to their own needs, then present their definitions as neutral and timeless. We talked about this during the review of Democracy at Work, where Wolf talks about how those who control the surplus of society dictate how society is run, determining what is considered criminal behavior worthy of the death penalty, like killing someone with a knife, and what is considered just part of doing business, worthy only of a small fine, such as killing scores of people in work-related accidents or pollution. Gelderloos argues that our current societal view of criminality creates hierarchies of morality and power between the criminal and the dispensers of justice. It denies the criminal the resources he may need to reintegrate into the community and to stop hurting others. For alternatives to our current system, Gelderloos discusses the 1919 general strike in Seattle, where workers and veterans responded to calls for help with warnings and persuasions, and in Osaka City in 2006, where popular assemblies organized volunteers to maintain relative peace despite the state violence. Discussing violent crime, Gelderloos comes to the same conclusion as Kropotkin in Conquest of Bread, or Berkman in ABCs of Anarchism, or Goldman in Anarchism and Other Essays, namely that violent crime will go down when we socially address the material conditions that lead to such crimes. Gelderloos states, "Violent crime, such as murder, would probably decrease dramatically in an anarchist society because most of its causes, poverty, televised glorification of violence, prisons and police, warfare, sexism, and the normalization of individualist and antisocial behaviors, would disappear or decrease." And he gives some examples of this in practice. The Zapotec people in Mexico, Semai people in Norway, and various indigenous groups in North America. Looking at violence within the home, such as sexual abuse or domestic violence, Gelderloos argues that imprisoning the perpetrator fails to solve their abusive behavior. And on top of this, if the victim or victims are financially reliant upon the abuser, this might cause them to not report the criminal behavior. Gelderloos says that we should focus on a needs-based paradigm. He states, "This paradigm frames these forms of violence as social harm, and focuses on the needs of the survivor to heal and the need of the offender to become a healthy person who can relate to the broader community." And Gelderloos ends the chapter arguing that we need community-based approaches to justice, such as the diffuse sanctions discussed in Chapter 2.
From economics to organisation to crime, Gelderloos emphasises throughout how diffuse sanctions across communities often have the same effect as a legal system, normalising certain behaviours and promoting social cohesion. He writes that Western civilization devotes an immense amount of resources to social control, policing, and cultural production, reinforcing capitalist values. The Western idea of human nature functions as a part of this social control, discouraging rebellion against authority. We are taught from childhood that without authority, human life would descend into chaos. Furthermore, we're taught this by the only organisation in history that have eviscerated cities with nuclear bombs, mass murdered millions in death camps, and fought endless destructive wars with one another. The Iroquois League, a confederation of tribes formed in 12th century North America, involved the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Mohawks, amongst others. Their history of fighting and warfare pushed them to set up a confederation which promoted peace for over 500 years until it was pushed to breaking point because of European colonialism. The League influenced the founding fathers of America to organize into a confederacy themselves and was greatly admired by Benjamin Franklin. Anthropologist Harold Barclay describes how mutual connections between individuals and groups lead to stability in this way. He says, among the Tonga and some East African pastoralists, large populations may be integrated by a more complex arrangement which affiliates the individual with a number of cross-cutting and bisecting groups so as to extend his or her social ties across a wide area. In other words, individuals and groups constitute a multitude of interconnected loci, which produces the integration of a large social entity, but without any actual centralized coordination. Hunter-gatherers frequently rely on levelling mechanisms to bring down would-be bullies and authoritarians, taking them back down to earth. He cites anthropologist Christopher Boehm, who writes that the primary and most immediate cause of egalitarian behaviour is a moralistic determination on the part of a local group's main political actors that no one of its members should be allowed to dominate the others. Ostracism, ridicule, and a disdain for arrogance and ego are common in non-state societies. Many anarchist movements, like the worker takeover of the Zanon ceramics factory in Argentina, have equalized wages and rotated managerial tasks to prevent a dominating managerial class from emerging. Gelderloos writes that, among other things, Paracon, which is a participatory economy, emphasises the importance of empowering all workers by mixing tasks that are creative and rote, mental and manual, thus creating balanced job complexes that will prevent the emergence of a managerial class.
Chapter 6. Revolution. To start, Gelderloos describes what revolution means. To put an end to all coercive hierarchies and open space for organizing a horizontal, liberated society, people must overcome the repressive powers of the state, abolish all institutions of capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, and create communities that organize themselves without new authorities. And Gelderloos talks about anarchist, non-hierarchical groups fighting and winning against state repression in the early Russian Revolution, in Ukraine, in Spain, in Germany, in Austria, as well as indigenous nations fighting the United States, such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, and the Mohawk Nation. Regarding reparations and the likely thirst for revenge against the oppressor,
Such a lust for revenge!
Gelderloos states, like all good things in life, solidarity is shared. Thus, it destroys the categories of giver and receiver, and neither ignores nor validates whatever unequal power dynamics may exist between the two. He adds, anarchy must make itself wholly incompatible with colonialism, either a colonialism that continues to the present day in new forms, or a historical legacy which we try to ignore. One of the last points Gelderloos makes is one that I often make against ANCAPs and capitalist libertarian types. He states, in a non-coercive society, social structures cannot force people to live in accordance with anarchist values. People have to want to do and personally identify with such values themselves. Fortunately, the act of rebelling against an authoritarian capitalist culture can itself popularize anti-authoritarian values. Basically, just like in my home country of Cascadia, folks don't sell themselves into chattel slavery. It's not because they lack the freedom to choose to do so, but because our material conditions, we are socially and materially not so desperate and we have better options available to us. Similarly, an anarchist society would not need to force someone to be anarchist, to force them not to make a capitalist enterprise. It's more that in a truly free society, you would have a hard time finding folks willing to submit to an authoritarian wage-slave structure. And Gelderloos concludes stating, history is full of evidence that people can overthrow their oppressors without replacing them. A revolutionary movement must reject all possible government and reforms as to not be recuperated. Check out my review of State and Revolution if you'd like to see more about that. Chapter 7. Neighboring Societies. Can an anarchist society live in peace with their neighbors? No. And not for lack of trying, but as Gelderloos puts it, states and capitalism are imperialist by nature, and they will always try to conquer neighbors and universalize their rule. Gelderloos discusses how the all-encompassing oppression of global capitalism has created worldwide resistance to it, and he talks about drawing inspiration from indigenous groups such as the Seminole tribe in Florida and the Mapuche in Chile and Argentina, as well as the pirates in the Caribbean and Northern African regions. And he concludes the chapter arguing that communication is now global, population density and resistance to disease are more evenly distributed, and the popular weapons necessary for waging effective defensive warfare against the most technologically advanced of armies, assault rifles and explosives, are available in most parts of the world and can be manufactured at home. So what are we waiting for? The time for revolution is now. Grab up your arms and Or maybe we need to build more class consciousness and bring some more folks over to anarchism first. But anyways, is there anything you'd like to add, Lewis?
In general, I think many of the central arguments for anarchism can be approached through the question of what order is, what it means, how it would manifest, as the O in the anarchist symbol and Proudhon's phrase, anarchy is the mother of order, both testify. In short, it's the question of how order would flourish where many would expect chaos. Throughout the book, Gelderloos returns to the Hobbesian critique that societies without a centralised authority would descend into chaos as the strong take advantage of the weak. He reminds us what is obvious but often neglected. No bully is stronger than an entire community. Again, this task begins by denaturalising our idealised view of modern state security because, he writes, many people have internalised the rationalisations of state justice. The police developed at a time when crime, especially murder and violent crime, was already decreasing and capitalism was expanding. Petty crime due to poverty and hunger made up the vast majority of prosecutions in the 19th century, and working class vices, gambling, drunkenness and vagrancy were targeted by the authorities. 19th century statecraft in Europe attempted to universalise the law, ignoring local context, poverty, hunger, and individual factors. To further demystify the idea that our current system protects us, and writing this in 2010 before the Me Too movement, by the way, Gelderloos makes a prescient condemnation of sexual misconduct in Hollywood, while also pointing to the failures of institutions like the church. In short, the idea that it's institutions like the state that's protected women from things like marital abuse is pretty laughable. Are we sure the state protects us in other areas as much as is often thought? After again denaturalising the status quo, Gelderloos points to the variety of solutions societies have developed as alternatives to what we often see as the universal necessity of the police and prison system in the West. The Navajo peacemaking method, for example, involves impartial peacemakers that can mediate during problems. He writes, when members of the Navajo community try to explain why people do harm to themselves or others, they say that those responsible for a harm behave that way because they've become disconnected from the world around them, from the people they live and work with. They say that person acts as if he has no relatives. Gelderloos reminds that anarchists aren't opposed to security per se, pointing to the top aisles used during the 5 months of autonomy in Oaxaca City. They'd patrol the streets and respond to crime with solutions that depended on the context. This type of decentralised response to crime is common in stateless societies. He writes, bad behaviour is not dealt with by specialised defenders of justice, but by everyone, through what anthropologists call diffuse sanctions, sanctions or negative reactions that are diffused throughout society. The Rotterdam South Pacific Islanders, for example, are socialised not to be violent. Physical punishment is rare, and shame is used as a disciplining tool for children. The murder rate is around 2 per 100,000. That's 3 times lower than the US. The Semi of Malaysia have no police, no prisons, and a similarly low murder rate.
Yeah, let's hope that such examples of anarchist peace exist in Chapter 8, The Future. This chapter is, of course, about thinking about the future, but more specifically, it's about taking stock of the examples covered in the text and what that means for the future of anarchism. To start, Gelderloos admits that most of the examples cited in this book no longer exist, and some only lasted a few years. These stateless societies and social experiments were mostly conquered by imperialist powers or oppressed by the states. But history has also shown that revolution is possible, and that revolutionary struggle does not inevitably lead to authoritarianism. Reflecting on the groups discussed in the text, he states, "A diverse mix of horizontalism, indigenism, autonomism, and anarchism have come to the foreground in all the exciting social rebellions of the last decade. The popular uprisings in Algeria and Argentina, Bolivia, and Mexico, the autonomen in Italy, Germany, and Denmark, the students and insurgents in Greece, the farmers' struggle in Korea, and the anti-globalization movements have a chance of abolishing the state and capitalism amidst the crises of the coming years. Luckily, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can join or even just take inspiration from the action that exists all around us." And Gelderloos concludes that there may already be anti-authoritarian groups active in your area. You could also start your own group. One great thing about being an anarchist is you don't need permission. And finally, Chapter 9, It Works When We Make It Work. This chapter is a reflection on the act of anarchist action that was the making of this book, its goals, and what it hopes to provide for and inspire in its readers. And Gelderloos concludes the text stating, "These stories show that anarchy can work, but we have to build it ourselves. The courage and confidence we need to do this cannot be found in any book. They already belong to us. We only have to claim them. May these stories jump off their pages and into your hearts and find new life." Conclusion. Well, we have reached the end. Any final thoughts, Lewis?
I really liked this book. It's a great introduction, it's accessible, it's broad. I would have liked a little bit more reference to the classical anarchists, although I appreciate this isn't a book about theory, but there wasn't much reference to the rich history of anarchist thought in the 19th century, for example. There's also some great historical literature on how even under the state, most people live their lives anarchistically day to day. And this was even more the case before modernity, before the modern state. There were a few bits I disagreed with. The idea that children are capable of educating themselves, and the idea that scarcity is a dangerous illusion veer, in my view, into idealism. While we do live in a world of inequality and abundance, scarcity certainly can be a destabilizing problem under certain conditions, so I think it's important not to ignore that. I was also alarmed by the suggestion that I might not be able to get a bar of chocolate under anarchism. But short of that, Anarchy Works manages to pull together an array of modern and historical examples in an accessible, pragmatic, and thematic way. Recommended.
Yeah, I suppose it's all a point of perspective. I wouldn't miss out on chocolate for understandable reasons, but like Emma Goldman says about revolutions in dancing, I know that I wouldn't want to be any part of a revolution that didn't have frisbees, so I guess I can relate. And also, thank you, Lewis, for helping me tackle this text. I really appreciate your help. Now, what do I have to say about this book? Well, although this text was certainly interesting and worthwhile to read cover to cover, it is also just as excellent as an encyclopedic-style collection of real-world examples of anarchist philosophy in practice. Basically, anyone coming to you with a "anarchism could never work because of this" type declaration, well, this text is full of ready-made examples to the contrary. Now, you could totally buy the book and own it, which is pretty cool. I recommend doing that. But it's also, of course, available on the anarchistlibrary.org website for free, if you need to access it from your phone or computer on the fly. Maybe you've got folks coming up to you with questions about how anarchism would work, or maybe you're asking those questions yourself, and you've got a book to refer to for those answers. So, if that's what you need, I recommend checking out Anarchy Works, Examples of Anarchist Ideas in Practice by Peter Gelderloos. And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. Your tremendous support has allowed me to get dog insurance, which is wonderful. You've allowed me to support other creators I couldn't otherwise support. Gotta love that. You helped me prove that Anarchy works by helping me to provide free information about anarchism with funds for books and dog toys and things like that. So that's all really awesome. I appreciate you folks a lot. And if you like what I do here and you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
Got all the charisma on the garden snail, and you get your sex tips from the Daily Mail. We don't give a fuck about what you say, 'cause we know that anarchists make better lovers anyway.